morning, good morning, good morning. Once again, we welcome you to our Wednesday Bible study. Today we're in the sixth installment of our examination of the 11th chapter of the book of Hebrews, where Paul lists what we're calling the giants of faith. Now, in the 10th chapter of the book of Romans, Paul tells the church at verse 17, so then faith cometh by hearing, and hearing by the word of God. Now, contextually, he was speaking about their faith in believing that Jesus was the Christ. But the concept works for our faith as we also, who believe in Jesus, we are in uncharted waters with this coronavirus. And if we ever needed faith, we need it right now. For those of you who've been Christians for a long time, you've heard many sermons and many lessons on faith. And somewhere in your memory are verses that have reaffirmed your faith or fortified your faith, strengthened your faith. For most of you, these stories that we're reading are not new. But if our prior studies have taught us anything, they've shown us the value of reminders. We quickly forget. We try to remember, but we still forget. No wonder God commanded that the Passover be celebrated annually so that Israel would not forget. No wonder Jesus commanded that we remember his death when we take the Lord's Supper every Lord's Day. Why? Because we will forget. We don't think we'll forget. While we're remembering, we don't expect to forget, but we will forget. And unfortunately, too many times we have forgotten what God has already done for us. Right now, our minds are on things that are not part of our old way of life. There are many who are frightened about what may come next. There are many who don't have basic necessities of life. There's emotional pressure of having to stay inside. There's dismay over not being able to fellowship like we're accustomed to. And these lessons that we're looking at in these series are designed to show you what faith can do. The list of the giants of faith is designed to remind you of the tremendous accomplishments made by those who had faith. They were not the most powerful, they had faith. They were not the richest or the strongest or the wisest or even the most well-known, but they had faith. And as we examine those characters, we'll find that oftentimes they weren't even that good, but they had faith. With what I know about our Father in heaven, there's certain things that the Bible record has proven to me. One is he knew this was coming. He knows all things and was not taken by surprise even though we were. He knows how long it's going to last. We never know. But I believe he gave us what we need to survive. God never takes us to a place where he can't protect us and has not already provided for us. And that includes into the clutches of this COVID-19. I pray that you will meditate on these lessons. Take hold of the things the Bible is trying to teach us. We've seen some wonderful things that God did for Abel and Enoch and Noah and Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and Moses and his parents. Let's continue today in our study to see God moving in Moses' life because of his faith. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. By faith, Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. In Acts chapter 7, as Stephen is giving his final speech before being stoned, he mentions Moses. Verses 22 through 29, and Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and was mighty in words and in deeds. And when he was full 40 years old, it came into his heart to visit his brethren, the children of Israel. And seeing one of them suffer wrong, he defended him, and avenged him that was oppressed, and smote the Egyptian. For he supposed his brethren would have understood how that God by his hand would deliver them, but they understood not. And the next day he showed himself unto them as they strove, and would have set at one again, saying, Sirs, ye are brethren, why do ye wrong one to another? But he that did his neighbor wrong thrust him away, saying, Who made thee a ruler and a judge over us? Wilt thou kill me, as thou didst the Egyptian yesterday? Then fled Moses at this saying, and was a stranger in the land of Midian, where he begat 2 sons. Now, it's not stated, but it's not hard to believe that Moses received the history of Israel and learned of their God at his mother's knee. He knows that he is a Hebrew, and he chooses to be aligned with them and suffer affliction with them. Now, the killing of the Egyptian and the rejection of his brethren caused him to have to leave Egypt. He finally settled in Midian, where he married and had 2 sons. Now, the Hebrew writer says that Moses did this by faith. Whatever he learned about Jehovah, it was enough to convince him that to be on the Lord's side. To be on the Lord's side was more desirable than the pleasures of the palace. And it's interesting, of all Moses did, the writer starts with this. Moses' faith caused him to make the decision to leave. I believe that we already have enough evidence to stay on the Lord's side. That's why I want your faith to be strengthened and not get weak during this pandemic. Continuing chapter 11, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 26, the King James Version says, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. This same verse in the NIV version says, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. The writer in Hebrews compares the reproach that Moses endured with the reproach or the disgrace that Christ endured. He stated that Moses made a choice to suffer reproach because he looked for his reward. And when you exercise faith, you'll not always appear to others to have made the right choice. Standing with Jehovah or standing with the Lord is not popular, and sometimes it's not easy. I believe that this is why Paul mentions it. He could have easily started with the plagues or the Exodus, but he chose to detail the events that motivated Moses. Verse 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Here the Hebrew writer implies that Moses was able to see ahead knowing the promises of God and seeing him who is invisible. Now, his actions are consistent with those in the prior verses where he left the pleasures of the palace to suffer affliction with his brethren. This thought is in line with his being raised by his Hebrew mother and deciding to align himself with his Hebrew brethren. He would not have learned of Jehovah in his education in the palace. He had to learn that from someone who knew the Lord. So, moving by faith, Moses chooses to leave Egypt. And when you move by faith, people will not always agree with your actions. Now, as we go through Paul's examples of faith, notice how he keeps the timeline in order. He said the elders received a good report by faith. Then he starts at the beginning. We believe the world was created by God. How? By faith. Then he names the elders that he was making reference to: Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. That lets me know that from the beginning of time up until the Exodus, folk were relying on God. There is no time in the history of mankind that faith in God is not needed. And let me tell you something, now is no exception. Let's look at verse number 28. Through faith, he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood, lest he that destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Now, not knowing how Jehovah would deliver Israel from Egypt, Moses kept the commandment of God by choosing, sacrificing, and eating of the lamb. He then sprinkled the blood on the doorpost in obedience to the commandment. Let's look at the background on this passage in Exodus chapter 12, beginning at verse number 1 and going through verse 14. And Jehovah spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak ye unto all the congregation of Israel, saying, In the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to the house of their fathers, a lamb for a house. And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of the souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your account for the lamb. The lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. Ye shall take it out from the sheep or from the goats, and ye shall keep it up unto the 14th day of the same month. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And they shall take of the blood and strike it on the two side posts and on the upper doorposts of the house, wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night, and roast with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat not of it raw, nor sodden at all with water, but roast with fire his head with his legs and with the purtenance thereof. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, and that which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt this night, and will smite all the firstborn in the land, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Israel I will execute judgment. I am Jehovah. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you, when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial, and ye shall keep it, a feast to Jehovah throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. We know that their faith was rewarded. The reader, being a Hebrew, would also know that their faith was rewarded. This further magnifies the fact that when you obey through faith, your faith will be rewarded. Point to consider. When God gave the instructions for the Passover, it's just inspiring to me to think all the Hebrews on the 10th day of the month were out choosing their lamb. All the Hebrews on the 14th day of the month were cooking their lamb. All the Hebrews ate the same thing the night the death angel came. All the Hebrews had blood on the doorposts and over the top of in the front of their houses. All the Hebrews were eating with their shoes on and with their loins girded and their staff in their hands. And then the next day, all the Hebrews were taking all the leftovers and burning them. And I think about the fact that this came on the heels of all the plagues on Egypt. I wonder how many would have obeyed before God showed himself. And that's what I want you to understand. God has already shown himself to us, and we need to remember that he is still in charge. Verse 29 of Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, they passed through the Red Sea, as by dry land, which the Egyptians are saying to do were drowned. And you know the story. Pharaoh finally let Israel go, but changed his mind after their departure. Now they're trapped by the Red Sea with no apparent way out. Exodus chapter 14, verses 21 through 31. And Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and Jehovah caused the sea to go back by a strong east wind all that night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. And the Egyptians pursued and went in after them to the midst of the sea, even all Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen. And it came to pass that in the morning watch, that Jehovah looked unto the host of the Egyptians through the pillar of fire and of the cloud, and troubled the host of the Egyptians, and took off their chariot wheels, that they drave them heavily, so that the Egyptians said, Let us flee from the face of Israel, for Jehovah fighteth for them against the Egyptians. And Jehovah said unto Moses, Stretch out thy hand over the sea, that the waters may come again upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen. And Moses stretched forth his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to his strength when the morning appeared. And the Egyptians fled against it. And Jehovah overthrew the Egyptians in the midst of the sea. And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the hosts of Pharaoh that came unto the sea after them. They remained not so much as one of them. But the children of Israel walked upon dry land in the midst of the sea, and the waters were a wall unto them on their right hand and on their left. Thus Jehovah saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore. And Israel saw that great work which Jehovah did upon the Egyptians. And the people feared Jehovah and believed Jehovah and his servant Moses. Before Christ came, we see here the most magnificent display of the power of God to deliver his people. Imagine Moses' joy as he could tell Israel, see, I told you Jehovah would deliver us. God's plan was not revealed before they left. He didn't know what would happen. He just moved by faith. They'd never been chased by Pharaoh before. They'd never been trapped before. They had suffered oppression, but they'd never been threatened with execution before. They'd never been in danger of losing all their possessions before. They'd never crossed between two walls of water before. They'd never seen water stand up like that. So that would have brought fear upon them. But now they're looking at it and say, we got through it. It might save Pharaoh too. Through all of these fears, God came through. And I marvel at the courage of those Hebrews to walk through that dry sea with water standing up on each side. I've never seen anything like that. They had never seen anything like that. And I'm sure there were some nervous Hebrews going through that sea. But God delivered them, afraid or not. We've never seen this pandemic before, but God will come through. We just have to have faith. The lessons of the Passover are powerful and pertinent to our current situation. Fear of the Egyptians had gripped the Hebrews. They accused Moses of bringing them out in the wilderness to die. What, there were no graves in Egypt? Now God sends the wind to part the waters of the Red Sea. They'd never seen anything like it before. We're now facing a plague that we have never seen before. They could only be delivered by acting on their faith. I mean, if you look and see water standing up on the left hand or right, you might not be so anxious to step out there. You'll need faith to be delivered. And I believe that we need our faith to be not only delivered in this situation, but to be sustained in this situation. Because remember, even though Israel had left Egypt, they hadn't made it to the promised land yet. They still had to be delivered. And they were not yet in the promised land. So they needed to have faith or reliance on God in order to make the trip. And many of you in our study of Exodus, you saw how God tested Israel time and time again to see if they really would rely on him. We can make it through this episode. Trust that God is still in control. Rely on him to provide what you need. And then when this battle is over, we can praise him like we never did before. I hope these lessons have helped you to strengthen your faith. We need our faith in times like these. We look forward to being with you on next Wednesday as we go into the furtherance of our study in the Hebrew giants of faith. God bless you.